Hello, I'm Elise Labott of Foreign Policy Magazine and glad to be with you at Aspen Ideas Health. Today we're talking about obesity and the epidemic of cardiometabolic disease, which is the leading cause of death among human beings. And the numbers are staggering and they're growing. And beyond the biological effects, there are a number of societal factors that make treating these diseases even more challenging. Joining me to talk about this is Dr. Morris Birnbaum, Senior Vice President and Chief Scientific Officer at Pfizer's Internal Medicine Research Unit. Maury, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Elise. It's really a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, well, look, everyone is so focused on the COVID-19 pandemic over the last year or so. And I think there's this tendency, isn't there, to focus less on other health concerns, especially cardiovascular disease, which, as we know, is one of the number one cause of death. So why should we be so concerned about what you call these cardiometabolic diseases?
Uh, right now, well, I mean, first of all, it's totally understandable and justifiable to be concerned with COVID for the last
Of
year.
course.
Um, but COVID actually turns out to be a reminder of why it is so important to think about metabolic disease and obesity. One of the most significant risks for serious disease in COVID is, in fact, obesity.
Mm.
And that is very typical of this abnormal metabolic state. Obesity, when it leads to insulin resistance and abnormal metabolism, increases your risk, not only for COVID, serious COVID, but for heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and many other chronic systemic diseases, which really have a profound negative effect on people's lives.
And it's like this problem is largely unaddressed and few medications to help the problem, and it's global really in scope.
Well, exactly. And it really reflects the change in our environment over the last 50 to 100 years. We didn't evolve to deal with all of the food around us. And we also didn't evolve to have other means of transportation other than walking. So we're leading a very, very different life than we were meant to in some senses. And that's frankly what's created it. So it's easy to say, and many people suggest, well, then why don't we just eat less and exercise more? And that is a prescription that works on paper or ideally, but in reality, because of physiological changes that accompany obesity, that in reality is extremely difficult to carry out.
Now, you view these diseases as a single epidemic as opposed to individual problems because they're all interrelated. Now, talk to us about that. And how does, for instance, unintentional weight loss fit in? It seems like the opposite of obesity, but it's also very dangerous.
Right. I guess the best way to describe our view of these metabolic diseases is a cluster of related diseases, which probably have a common origin. Uh, it is interesting that these diseases all seem to be promoted by an abnormal metabolic state. And yes, kidney disease, heart disease, blindness, they all come out, they're all different expressions of the metabolic state. But we believe that by understanding how the metabolic state, this abnormal metabolic state, promotes these diseases and interrupting that connection, we could actually develop one therapy or set of therapies that actually going to impact a lot of different diseases. So it really is this common basis of these seemingly disparate diseases that has led us to a science-based strategy to try to treat them all. Now, that is not to say that we and other folks are not trying to treat them in the traditional way of developing directed heart drugs. We do that also. But what's a little bit more unusual about our approach now is we really think about these diseases more in the context of the abnormal metabolism that promotes it. Now, it's interesting you mentioned cachexia. Cachexia is unintended weight loss, which is also associated with an abnormal metabolic state. In obesity, the problem is we store too many nutrients and can't control that. In cachexia, the problem is we burn those nutrients and we can't stop that loss of muscle mass and we lose our appetite. So it's in many ways, it is the opposite of obesity. And the reason we work on it is twofold. First, it's an extremely common disease, which is incredibly disruptive for patients and their families. And second of all, the expertise we have in developing drugs to modify people's metabolism and modify their appetite, that expertise can really be used to address problems in cachexia.
Now, you mentioned the stigma around obesity. I'm glad you did because I feel like a lot of people, don't even seek treatment for obesity because of the attitude surrounding this, that it's self-inflicted, as you say, or a lifestyle choice. And then, as you mentioned, that leads to depression and so much more than a, kind of typical biological condition.
Well, yes, I mean, there is a pervasive stigma about obesity. There's a bias against uh, obese people generally, and it's irrational, and it's just really it comes down to another form of prejudice that is not based on any fact at all. Now, the community has been trying to emphasize, the scientific community has been trying to emphasize that it isn't a choice. It's not a behavioral choice. It's a disease. The issue becomes many people who are obese, when they hear they have a disease, accept that as a negative, a judgment on them, and that's really not what we mean when we say diabetes and obesity, and particularly obesity or diseases. So there's a real gap here in knowledge, and a real gap here in language that we can use, where that language is not associated with implications that we really don't mean.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard so much in the last year about the importance of science. Connect the dots for me between all of the knowledge Pfizer is accumulating over the years about how these diseases arise in and affect the body, with this kind of recentering on research and development as a means to develop potential treatments.
Right. I mean, developing an effective, safe drug is an enormously complicated process, which involves a lot of people. But it is always based on a scientific understanding. The drug will not work if our understanding of the biology and our strategy to change the biology or to fix the biology, if that isn't sound, no matter how well we do all of the other things necessary to develop a drug, it's not going to work.
It has to be more than just a Band-Aid.
It has to be more than just a Band-Aid, and it's very challenging. To be honest, it's too much for the pharmaceutical industry to do alone. We do this in collaboration with our academic colleagues. We do often do it in collaboration with other pharmaceutical companies. But underneath all of that, we at Pfizer have to understand the basic biology of the disease, and that results from being aware of the academic community, as well as many, many years at Pfizer of making drugs like, for example, blood pressure drugs, lipid drugs, which we've been incredibly successful about. It's helped a lot of people, but it's also given us a lot of experience, and that's going to benefit people who have other diseases when we develop drugs for that.
Well, clearly, as we continue to learn about and combat all the health issues related to the coronavirus, it's important that we keep on top of these other diseases that are equally deadly and can really affect our quality of life if not treated. And we know that Pfizer is working on treatments to address them. Dr. Morris Birnbaum, Senior Vice President and Chief Scientific Officer at Pfizer's Internal Medicine Research Unit. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Elise. It's been a pleasure.